in this episode.
So one of the important distinctions I think we need to make when talking about naturalism, which you brought up in your question, is between methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism. So methodological naturalism is a presupposition of science, and it's basically the idea that we need to assume that the world is entirely naturalistic. That means it's entirely ruled by physical laws, material processes, and there's nothing supernatural in it. Without methodological naturalism, you can't do science because you'd always be potentially saying, well, there could be some supernatural influence here that we can't measure, etc. So methodological naturalism is essential for the practice of science, and theologians who are interested in science totally acknowledge that fact and say we need to protect methodological naturalism in science. What they critique is metaphysical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism goes above and beyond that to say there is nothing else other than what can be measured by science. Now, I think I'm probably more sympathetic to metaphysical naturalism than any Christians, but it so that's an important distinction that we want to make. They're not saying by saying that we need to engage with natural laws and with science, they're not committing themselves to that extra assumption that the world doesn't contain anything other than those natural laws. You need that to do science.
Hey everyone, welcome to my conversation with the philosopher of physics and theologian, Dr. Emily Qureshi-Hurst. Emily is a philosopher and researcher working on understanding belief, specifically Christian belief, amidst the findings of modern physics, such as quantum mechanics and general relativity, of course. And when I did come across her work, what I initially found quite interesting was the fact that he is a thinker, a philosopher, seriously taking the questions of modern physics, interpreting them, trying to make sense of them, and then trying to meaningfully connect them to our subjective experience, specifically the subjective experience of being a believer, of having a spiritual life or a religious life. And in fact, when the podcast started, I did quote to her the famous quote by Immanuel Kant, where he speaks of the moral law within and the starry heavens above. And I always deeply resonated with that quote, mainly because I think it seems that these two realities of human experience are unbridgeable. They speak to two realities that we simply can't comprehend, can't coexist together. Nonetheless, that's what makes something like philosophy quite interesting because, as she did mention in her book, it acts as a sort of meta language where these ostensibly siloed fields or even realities can speak to each other. Apart from that, I also enjoyed the fact that Emily does lay down sort of a history of time, all the way from Heraclitus to the medieval philosophers, and then, of course, the more contemporary and analytic philosophy, the A, B, and C theories of time. Again, in light of the findings of modern physics, I should mention this. I didn't mention this. Emily's book is her latest book is God's Salvation and the Problem of Spacetime. Although there's going to be another upcoming book, which I'll leave a link to it in the description down below, regarding the block universe, so the theory of the block universe in physics, and then what that means for salvation in a religious believer or a Christian. And she uses the work by Paul Tillich to explore these questions that are fundamental to the Christian doctrine, such as salvation, eschatology, and of course, belief in God, or even the existence of God and the nature of God. And again, I guess the overall point I'm trying to make here is that I do like that a person who is taking theology seriously is also at the same time taking the philosophy of physics or the interpretations of physics seriously and trying to see if we can let these two, again, ostensibly siloed disciplines or fields talk to each other. And I think it's a worthwhile effort. And on top of that, of course, Emily, Dr. Qureshi-Hurst, works through an analytic philosophy lens. It's quite clear the way she lays down her arguments. It's in the tradition of analytic philosophy. But still, she's incorporated the works of someone like Paul Tillich, who is a very interesting thinker himself, who we worked through Heidegger, Hegel, of course Kierkegaard, and worked through so-called colonial philosophers. And it's interesting to see how you could take someone like him, his work, and bring it to life in our contemporary world, in the setting of analytic philosophy, let's say. That being said, a bit of a formal introduction to Emily. Dr. Emily Qureshi-Hurst is a junior research fellow at Pembroke College and a college lecturer in philosophy at Oriel College in Oxford. Dr. Qureshi-Hurst completed a doctorate in philosophy at the University of Oxford in science and religion. Her thesis examined the theoretical support for a B theory of time provided by special and general relativity and reinterpreted Paul Tillich's doctrine of salvation in light of this metaphysical temporal model. In 2022, Cambridge University Press published her first book exploring these themes, God, Salvation, and the Problem of Spacetime. Her second book on this topic, Salvation in the Block Universe, Time, Tillich, and Transformation, will be published in the second half of 2024. Without further ado, here's my conversation with Dr. Emily Qureshi-Hurst. But as I said on the review, it's sort of like I like that before you get into the theology, you lay down kind of the metaphysical aspects of or the metaphysics of time in and pertaining to analytic philosophy. So it was a good refresher, let's say. But yeah.
Great.
Yeah. When's the other book with like Paul Tillich? I've got a few questions on that, but obviously because I couldn't read it, I don't really have any substantial questions. But when's that coming out?
Yeah. So it was supposed to be out 2 days ago, but I don't know if you've heard, you probably haven't, but Cambridge University Press had a big cyber incident. I don't know exactly what happened,
Oh, okay,
but it
yeah.
was
No,
some
I
sort of
didn't.
hacking or something. And it's meant that all the books they were supposed to publish have been delayed. So it was supposed to be 2 days ago. I actually don't know when it's going to be instead. They haven't been able to tell me, but it could be in a few weeks. The publication date is 2024, so hopefully it'll come out before the end of the year. But every single book that CUP are publishing has been delayed,
Oh wow, so
and
quite bad
that
then.
you can't even
Yeah.
buy books from their website. It's really, really serious. I don't know what happened, but
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
A big press like that, I'm sure they've got like a plan B or some. I hope they have the data backed up. So yeah, yeah. Anyway.
I hope so. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I'm so sorry to hear. I mean, it's probably a like a because I know writing a book, it's such a life like it's a huge project, and you put in so much time, and you
Oh
kind of
yeah.
giving birth to a baby. You really wanted to get out at one point. So
Totally. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Hopefully it comes out eventually. Yeah, yeah. Because what I really liked was your interest in Paul Tillich. Now, in no way have I read Paul Tillich carefully, but I loved his essays, Dynamics of Faith, but also like his kind of more public lectures he gave, The Courage to Be. And I thought he was always an interesting thinker because um I don't know, sometimes more of like the I'm not a big fan of frankly, I'm not a big fan of Christian apologists. Like I find them a bit, I don't know, there's something, it seems like propaganda, to be honest. And there are thinkers like Paul Tillich though are quite interesting because I don't know, they revivify Christianity in through like a new lens, which you wouldn't have seen before. I even like some of the French existentialists. I want to ask you about them in a bit, who also do a similar thing where they see Christianity through like a new lens, which makes it a bit more interesting. Um, in fact, on the note, let's get into your work, if it's okay, Emily. There's a famous quote, if I could read it, by Immanuel Kant. I think it is in his second critique. He says that the two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The more often and steadily we reflect upon them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. And at least for me, so far from listening to your public lectures and your like podcasts, reading your books, I find that your work touches on these two aspects. So the moral law within me, for me, is just, well, simply religion. It's the fact that we feel like we're beings with a sense of morality, a conscience. We think right from wrong. We reflect on our actions, and then, of course, the starry heavens being the world of the natural sciences, or specifically what you work on, which is a kind of physics as such. And correct me if I'm wrong. I don't even think you're a believer or a Christian in any sense. But yeah, but
That's
still,
right. I'm not.
yeah. And I thought it was really interesting. So my question was more on the lines of the fact that there seems to be these two realities to our existence, this world within and the world outside. But then you also work on the philosophy of physics. You kind of theorize on what these be quantum mechanics or general relativity. But why is it a philosopher of physics who is, let's say, an agnostic atheist or whatever you may identify as, also a theologian interested deeply in these theological questions? And in fact, to put it crudely, why not just stick to one thing and stick to one side and not having to bridge these two uh, seemingly unbridgeable realities?
That's a really good question. And it's a question I've been asked a lot and a question I've thought a lot about. So there's a personal answer and then there's a more philosophical answer. Um, the personal answer is that I think I would get bored if I was just doing one thing in a lot of detail. What I find fascinating is having a broad understanding of the world and bringing different things together, making connections across lots of different areas. So it means you get to be a kind of jack of all trades. You get to look at religion, philosophy, physics, the historical relationship between science and religion. So it keeps things exciting for me, keeps it fresh, keeps it dynamic. So that's the personal answer. The more philosophical answer is, well, it begins with human nature. So we are fundamentally meaning making creatures. We don't just blindly walk around the world. We create and then engage with structures and systems of meaning. And two of the most significant overarching ways we've done this, narratives of meaning, we might call them, or structures of meaning, are science and religion. These are constructed ways of seeing the world that humans have developed over hundreds of years to answer questions like who are we? What's our place within the universe? Why are we here? And so I find that really, really fascinating. And I don't think you can really understand how humanity understands itself without looking both at science and religion and then seeing if there are any connections between the two. So that, yeah, personal answer and philosophical answer.
So, from reading, okay, let's this book, for instance, I could clearly see that you were pulling into kind of the metaphysics from the world of science. So you were discussing different interpretations or different theories of relativity. Well, there aren't different theories, but there are different interpretations. Or now I think more contemporarily quantum mechanics, really in our epoch, let's say. So it seems to me that religion as a field or theology as a field borrows from science, but can science borrow from the findings of theologians, or would that in some sense corrupt the scientific method?
So there are theologians and religious people who would say that science should look to theology because theology answers questions about deeper meaning. So, what does it mean to live a good life? What is the nature of the human? And theology deals with profoundly philosophical questions, which science does also have to deal with as well. Um, I think we run into some real problems, though, when we take theological claims or premises and situate them at the foundations of science. When you see bad science, poor science, pseudoscience, often there's religious or theistic motivations in it. Of course, not always. But something like the intelligent design movement, which I think has basically fallen off the face of the earth now, that this idea of trying to find evidence for design in evolution by seeing whether there's irreducibly complex structures that had to have been placed there by God and couldn't have been designed. Couldn't have evolved, had to be designed. This leads to terrible science. So I don't think scientists have to borrow from theologians in terms of which claims they should insert into their starting points or into their methodologies. But maybe theologians and philosophers can teach scientists about the boundaries of science. So if you see someone like Richard Dawkins and other new atheists saying things like science can answer all the questions we have, I mean, that's patently false. Science can't answer loads of questions. Science can't answer historical questions. Science can't answer questions about interpersonal relationships from within those relationships. I mean, it can talk broadly about hormones that are released through social behaviors, etc., but it can't explain what it means to love and be loved, for example. So scientists might learn from theologians and philosophers about where the appropriate boundaries of science are. You know, science does this, science answers these questions in these ways, and it shouldn't go outside the boundaries of that, because then you get into I don't know, you get into problematic territory, like with Richard Dawkins saying science can answer all the questions and science can definitely disprove religion, which most people working in science and religion now know to be just a completely false claim.
Yeah. Yep. And in fact, in the book, I even have that quote with me. You claim that, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, that in some sense, for all these disciplines, we need like a meta language or a language that can work within, be it science or theology or some other discipline. And for you, that's philosophy. I believe you paraphrase
Yeah.
Paul Tillich there. So I'm going to ask, this is probably a question that's been somewhat, I don't know, anachronistic, or like it's a boring question because philosophers ask this all the time. But I've got to ask you this too. But yeah, so what do you see as the role of philosophy in this? In fact, let me just put it very broadly. What do you think is the role of philosophy in epistemology or epistemic practices?
I don't think I can give you a simple answer to that question. I think the role of philosophy is rich and multifarious, and it actually really depends on what kind of philosophy you're doing. So philosophy is incredibly broad because you can have the philosophy of, and then almost everything else in human experience and in intellectual study. You have the philosophy of physics, the philosophy of love, philosophy of history, philosophy of biology. So I don't think you can really boil down what philosophy is all about in one sentence. Maybe I could talk about the role of philosophy in science and religion. So I think we really need to think about what science and religion are, and there are competing definitions of those. So let's start with science. You might think, because of the way science is taught in schools, that science is a body of knowledge, it's a set of facts. But the problem is, there's huge amounts of disagreement between scientists about what facts or what claims should make it into science. So we look at quantum mechanics. We've got the Copenhagen interpretation, the Everett interpretation, GRW, Bohmian mechanics, all of these different ways of interpreting the quantum mathematics that are empirically equivalent. If science is just a body of knowledge, which knowledge makes the cut? So it seems like that's a non-starter. If science is a methodology, now this is a much more promising line of inquiry. So this idea is that science is about its empirical method. It's about formulating testable hypotheses, going out into the world, trying to verify or falsify those hypotheses. It's about doing experiments and forming theories about those experiments. There's problems with this as well. There isn't really a single scientific method. There's really scientific methods. The way that we do geology, for example, is very different from the way that we do quantum mechanics and the way that we do animal behavior studies. But something along the lines of an empirical methodology is a more useful way to think about how we characterize science. So let's put that to one side for a second and think about what religion is. The general agreed kind of maybe definition, maybe broad way of characterizing religion is in the West is that it's a set of beliefs, belief in God, belief in a supernatural reality, and beliefs about how best to engage with that reality. But this is a very profoundly Western notion based on the framework of Christianity and gets imposed on other cultures in imperialist and neo-imperialist ways. For lots of other cultures, religion is about practice, it's about ritual, it's about community. So it's very difficult to say exactly what religion is either. It can't be just beliefs. It's got to be something to do with practice and community as well. So if science is a set of facts and religion is a set of beliefs, it's easy to see how they could interact with each other because they're both claims about reality and about the world. But if science is more about its empirical methodology, about how we go about asking questions of the world, and religion is about ritual and community as well as beliefs and truth claims, then it's harder to see how they communicate with each other. How can the experimental setup at CERN, the Large Hadron Collider, interact with the ritualistic taking of the Eucharist that Christians engage in? I mean, it's actually not really clear what that even means to bring them together. So this is where philosophy comes in. I think philosophy is the language that each can be translated into so that these conversations can take place and this analysis can occur. Another useful thing that philosophy can do is provide deep conceptual analysis. So talking about questions about what science is, what science purpose is, how science should best be carried out, how to get rid of biases in science. These are philosophical questions. And questions about the nature of God and the existence of God can also be philosophical questions as well. So without philosophy, you've got experiments and rituals trying to come into contact with each other, and that just doesn't really make any sense at all. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but that's what I mean by saying philosophy is a meta language, and also a conceptual framework within which science and religion can communicate with each other.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, I'm Emily, by the way, just be as long-winded as you want to be. I mean, this is a good thing about podcasts. We have no time limit. So the more long-winded you are, the better, in fact. So that was
Okay.
beautiful. It was very eloquently put. I completely agree. And I'm just, if you could humor me for a bit here, I spoke to the philosopher, Heideggerian phenomenologist philosopher, Simon Critchley, and he said something quite interesting. He said that in some sense, the philosophy is always an excess. And what he meant by that was that, it's even in the start of philosophy, you look at a character like Socrates. He was put to death. He was kind of like a pain in the ass in some sense, because a
Oh
philosopher,
yeah.
yeah, because he's constantly asking people, what is justice, what is truth, and the point, in my view, because this, when I spoke to him on the podcast, but also on his book, Infinitely Demanding, what I saw was that philosophy has to always play like an outsider role, in the sense that it can never be, because it can't be put into a specific discipline and be like, okay, this is the phenomena you're going to study. It's always, so a philosopher in that sense is always going to be like an outsider. You can't never really fit in within an institution. Even you can't really fit in within a specific department. And I think this beautifully connects to your initial point when I asked you what got you interested in these ostensibly different, theology and philosophy of science. And that's like a pattern I'm seeing when I talk to bona fide philosophers. They're very, to use a very overused cliche, lateral in their thinking. Whereas I've spoken to a few physicists. They're deeply philosophical. Like, that's one thing I realized. Physicists are a lot more philosophical than we think they are, but still, they kind of have, let's call it the Richard Dawkins bias. Their Weltanschauung, their worldview is through that paradigm of whatever their theory of physics is. So, and that's where I think philosophy always has to come in, because if not, we get lost in our kind of worldview. But I mean, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that.
I do. Yeah. Stephen Hawking, the late great Stephen Hawking, once said that philosophy is dead.
Yeah.
And what he meant by that, I mean, that's something that I think you're picking up on when you talk to physicists, is the idea that, okay, well, back in the day in ancient Greece, and even in before the early modern period, philosophy was the way that we came to understand the world. Philosophy provided us with the tools to think about things like matter, energy, motion, relationality, objects, the kind of questions that physics now answers. But since the early modern period and the development of natural science, we now have an empirical methodology to do that in a more reliable way. And so I think this is what Stephen Hawking was getting at, that philosophy is now redundant. We've got physics, we don't need anything else. And I think he was right about so many things, obviously, but he was really wrong about this, actually. I don't think you can do physics without philosophy. Without philosophy, physics is data and equations. You need something like philosophy to build a worldview out of that, to build theories out of it. And I think it's either disingenuous or naive to think that there's no role for philosophy in modern scientific thought. I actually think philosophy is baked into the very foundations of physics. And so we need an awareness of that. And also philosophy provides us with the critical tools to realize that science isn't as objective as scientists hope that it is. I mean, I still think that science is the most reliable means we have of understanding reality.
Epistemic.
But yeah, but it's not perfect, and it's not completely objective, because it's performed by humans, and we're fallible, we're flawed, we are biased, we don't make perfect measurements, we don't interpret things perfectly. research is led by funding bodies, and the amount that, you know, funding bodies have particular agendas. That's why string theory had so much money pumped into it. It was the hot, sexy topic, and it's not really come to anything, you know, yet. Maybe it will, but it seems like maybe we were going down in the wrong path. But no, not as many other theories of quantum gravity were being pursued because string theory was the hot topic of the day. So philosophy can also help science be a bit more self-critical. And in that sense, it's not dead with its role within physics, and it's also not dead in terms of how it needs to hold science to account. If you just bear with me, I'm going to just close the windows because I can hear the sounds of the building work.
Oh, that's all good.
Just
Yep, all good.
bear with me 1 second. I broke your train of thought.
No, that's all good. That's all good. I think we discussed that. Great. Many worlds. Oh yeah, yes. So excellent. I had one question to ask from you. I think you kind of already did intimate on this, let's say. But before we get to discussing your work specifically, I'm curious. You say you are an atheist, and I'm very interested in just let's call it the phenomenon of atheism in general, because atheism, you know, we have like these new atheists, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, and Christopher Hitchens, of course. But then we have like people like Voltaire, who was an atheist. Then there's Nietzsche, who's, you know, God is dead, big atheist. So, and I'm coming to realize, and Paul Tillich, in fact, makes this point. I think in Dynamics of Faith, I forget which of his books, that atheism in some sense has always been a part. It's been a part of religion. It's even in the Bible, the book of Job, for instance, you can see there's like a feeling of sense of doubt. I think G.K. Chesterton writes on this too. I'm curious. So when you say you aren't a believing Christian in that sense, but you deeply engage with Christianity, in fact, in a very deep sense, in an academic sense. Yeah, if I could put it again a bit like crudely, what kind of atheist are you? Is it the kind of the New Age Richard Dawkins kind of atheist, or do you take more of like a Nietzschean postmodern kind of atheism, or is it kind of like a Foucauldian? You know, it's all power, religion's all power. So just so that we have a bit of context as to where you come at, how you view religion, and probably Christianity in particular.
So I used to be a new atheist. When I was a teenager, I read The God Delusion. That was my first engagement with science and religion, and I loved it. I absolutely loved it. I was raised in a Christian family. Well, my grandparents and some aunts and uncles are Christian. My parents are not, they're not formally religious, but I think they're both spiritual. So I wasn't raised in an atheist context, but I never really, it just never really did anything for me, religion. And then I read Richard Dawkins, and I think teenagers, or at least, okay, I don't want to generalize. When I was a teenager, I was quite susceptible to black and white thinking.
Oh yeah, of
And
course.
so things are right, things are wrong, things are good, things are bad, whatever. So I read the God Delusion, and I was like, wow, he's totally right. This book is fantastic. It's a revolution. You know, loved it. And then I went to uni and studied philosophy and theology, and realized, okay, this book isn't as good as I thought it was, and I became very disillusioned with the new atheist movement. So I definitely wouldn't identify as a new atheist anymore. One of my main problems with new atheism, other than the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, they think that science can explain everything, which it can't. Because, for example, I gave the example of history earlier. Science can't empirically verify things that happened in the past. We have to use speculation. We have to look at sources and build our understanding out of various different disparate historical sources sometimes. That doesn't pass the threshold of a scientific theory. That doesn't mean it's not a worthy enterprise, and doesn't mean we can't make good and well-justified claims about what happened in the past. So science should be restricted to thinking about the natural world, the study of the Earth's composition, the study of the cosmos, the study of animals, etc. I found the new atheist's approach to science too expansive the more that I studied philosophy and theology, and realized there are different ways to come at these questions. Another problem I have with it is that the new atheists, in my reading of them, tend to equate religion with fundamentalism. And I know this is a critique that's been leveled at them before. And then some of them will say, oh, no, I don't mean all religion, I just mean fundamentalism. And then they'll go back to talking about religion again. Or they'll say fundamentalism, religion is a gateway drug to fundamentalism. And so once we allow more mild forms of religion in schools, once we normalize the concepts, then we open the door towards religious fundamentalism, and that closes down debate, or it stops people being critical thinkers. It makes people more wary of science. And I just think that's patently false. And when you look back across history, some of the greatest scientists ever to have lived were religious believers. Isaac Newton's the example I always come back to here. He is widely agreed to be the greatest physicist ever to have lived. He discovered gravity, theory of optics, his laws of motion. I mean, yeah, it's almost endless stuff that he wrote relating to physics. But not many people know this. He actually wrote more theology than he did physics. It's just that his theology was kind of crap. So, and the physics was pretty good.
Yeah, and I think alchemy too. He was also massively into alchemy.
Yeah. And so the idea that religion can distract you from science or stop you having a critical, rational mind is just false. We see that with excellent scientists who are actually motivated by their religious faith to do science. So the definition of religion that new atheists work with is really reductionistic, and it doesn't actually reflect what most religious believers see as their faith. So I feel like they're arguing against straw men. They're saying this is what religion is, we need to get rid of it. And most people who are religious say, well, that's not the kind of religion I experience. So I became very disillusioned with that kind of atheism. And I think it's seen its day. New atheism's on the decline. I don't know which school of thought I would put myself into, actually. I think religion is a part of almost every human society we know about. So it's worth engaging with, it's worth taking seriously. Very, very intelligent, sensible people are religious. I just happen to think that claims about belief in God are false, and rituals aren't going to do anything apart from maybe build social cohesion or something like that. So, yeah, I experience my atheism like the negation of belief in God. It's the absence of belief in God. But I hear from sociologists of religion that actually atheism itself is a worldview. It's not just the absence of a religious worldview. So my experience of my atheism doesn't really match up as neatly to the sociological research. I mean, I suppose it is a worldview in its own right, but I don't know if I'd situate myself in any specific atheistic tradition, other than to say I'm fascinated by religion. I think it can be really valuable to society, as well as, of course, be really damaging in the wrong hands. But I just happen to think that it's false.
Yeah. I mean, I think, but what I always found interesting was because I mean, I deeply resonate with you, kind of what you said about the new atheist God delusion. It's interesting that if you really take, let's say, like a rigorous skeptical scientific approach to studying phenomena, then the last thing one would want to do if one were, like, let's say, for instance, a social scientist, is to dismiss religion as being naive stupidity, because, like, mate, billions of people still believe in this stuff. I mean, it can't just be like it's just wishful thinking or woo-woo belief and then like ignore it. For me that wouldn't be the right even scientific approach. In some sense, the scientific approach would be to go and explore and investigate and theorize and try to make sense of this phenomena you see in reality. And that's
Absolutely.
one bias I'm coming to see. I think in modern people, we think the only phenomena that in some sense that has to be studied is like the only, we think what's real is physical, what we can feel and touch, the world of physics, for instance, when we think that's where reality lies, and everything else is some kind of, in like a very platonic sense, like a delusion or an illusion, and there's like a deeper truth. But for me, in fact, the philosopher Hegel makes this point that truth lies in appearance, that like the appearance of something itself has a substantial truth to it, and we can't just dismiss it. And for me, religious belief, both in fact, as you mentioned, the practice, but also belief is similar to that. Now, excellent. Thank you for, I guess, as I did mention before, I think it's good that we laid down a bit of the foundations before we get to, your specific work. But great. All right, your book on with Cambridge Elements, so the problems of God. Um, firstly, I kind of want to ask you, generally speaking, when you, I was going to say, sit down with your pen and paper, but we don't write on pen and paper anymore. On with your computer, what were you hoping to do in this book before you even started writing it? What was your intent behind writing this book? So just to mention for the listener, God, salvation, and the problem of space-time. Yeah.
So this book, although it's my first published book, it's not the first book that I wrote. So it actually stems from my PhD thesis, which I carried out at the University of Oxford from 2018 to 2021, I believe, and my master's degree before that. So I was interested in the nature of time, the nature of temporal reality, both as it's explained by physics and philosophy. And I initially thought that the way that we understand time I thought that it does raise particular problems for Christianity. So we can get into exactly what the details of those problems are, but it's a particular problem for salvation. So I undertook my PhD project, which is soon to be published as Salvation in the Block Universe, Time, Tillich and Transformation, and that should be coming out very soon with Cambridge University Press as well. That's the first book that I wrote, and this book stemmed from that. So my initial motivation was to identify a significant problem for the Christian doctrine of salvation that's raised by the philosophy and physics of time. Now, neither of those books stop there, but that's where I originally thought I would stop. I thought I would say, here is the philosophy and physics of time as we best understand it. And here is what Christianity says about the doctrine of salvation. And there's an incompatibility here. In a nutshell, our best theory of time, in my opinion, is the B theory or block universe, which says that change is not real, it's an illusion. The doctrine of salvation says that change is essential. You need to be able to transform from being fallen to being saved, to being sinful, to being redeemed. And I wanted to argue that that wasn't possible. But as I went through the project, I realized that there might actually be an interesting solution that I might be able to sketch out. And that's where the overarching argument of the book came in. So I use, in the book that's coming out soon, I use Paul Tillich and his philosophical theology to sketch a solution to this problem. And in God's Salvation and the Problem of Spacetime, I take a much more general approach. So instead of advancing a particular argument, I really want to introduce readers to this area. So the book covers the metaphysics of time from ancient Greece up to today. It also covers the physics of space-time, so Newtonian mechanics, special and general relativity, and quantum mechanics. And then it turns to philosophy of religion and theology and looks at the historical debates about God's relationship to time. And then I look at two problems for Christianity that arise from our best understandings of time and space-time. And that is the problem of personal salvation, which I tackle in my book that's coming out soon, and the problem of eschatology and the end of the universe. And so essentially the book seeks to walk readers through this really, really fascinating set of debates, beginning with the conceptual foundations from philosophy, then moving to physics, and then moving to theology, looking first at God and then to salvation and eschatology, to really address the question of, do these disparate sets of ideas really fit together? Is Christian theology, is the philosophy of religion tenable given what we know about the nature of time from physics and from philosophy?
Yeah, beautiful. In fact, 2 points I want to mention here is firstly, yeah, I really enjoyed that the first part of the book, for me as a neophyte, I haven't really thought much about the philosophy of time. The fact that you went through, through like Heraclitus to the medieval philosophers, and then of course more in like analytic philosophy, the A, B, and C theory of time. But then the other reason, I don't know, Emily, this is more of like a, sociological or history of let's call it, history of science question. there's this deep, intimate, almost relationship between theology and the philosophy of time. It seems so many theologians, you know, I think the name that comes to my head for sure is Aquinas and then Augustine.
Mhm.
They've deeply meditated and thought about and philosophized and theorized on time. So I don't even know if this is a question, but I'm just curious, like, why do you think in particular, you know, theology has this deep, close-knit relationship with trying to understand what time is?
Well, I think the answer to that is that I think we can find the answer to that by reflecting on our own experience of the world.
Interesting.
So we are inescapably temporal beings. Our lives have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Our experience is shaped by memories of the past, anticipation of future events, and the powerful immediacy of the present. We also see around us certain processes only go in one direction. You can't unscramble an egg. You can't uncook a cake. There seems to be a direction to time, and there seems, in our experience at least, to be a flow to time, which is actually something that I challenge in the book. But our experience of the world is fundamentally temporal. And the world itself, therefore, we might be able to argue, is fundamentally temporal. The created order, if you're a Christian, or the physical universe, you might want to call it, if not, is structured in accordance with the dimension of time. So, for that reason, all theological questions about the creator's relation to creation must, in some sense, consider the nature of time. And I think actually it's surprising that there hasn't been more reflection on time. Of course, lots of great theologians have thought about it. Lots of fantastic theologians and philosophers of religion are working on it now. But really, I think that these questions about the nature of time sit at the foundations of all of Christian theology,
Hmm.
because creation, the world, is fundamentally temporal. So if you want to understand the role of humans in the world, if you want to understand the relation of a creator to the world, you have to talk about time, and you have to talk about how a God that's supposed to be eternal, everlasting, infinite, could interact with the world of time. So classical Christian theologians, I mean, there's of course been various views over history, but the dominant view was that God was outside of time. So we might think of the universe like a book with all of the events ordered on the subsequent pages. They're in a particular order. And the characters in the book might seem as though they are experiencing time as it unfolds. But God would be like the author of the book, holding the book in his hands. He's outside of time. He's not within the pages of the narrative. And so he can look at any page he likes and not be trapped or bound by the structure of the book in his hands. And it's not a perfect analogy. The analogy that Aquinas used was that God was stood on top of a mountain. God was like a person stood on top of a mountain who could view everything before him at once. Whereas the people down below moving through the world have their own particular perspectives, and God can see everything from above. Again, it's not a perfect analogy. There are no perfect analogies for how we might think of God experiencing his relationship to time. But yeah, the classical view was that God was eternal. He was outside of time. He was changeless, and that's because he was perfect. So this comes from an idea that Plato had, that was anything that's perfect can't change. Because if
Hmm.
it's perfect, it's already in a state of perfection. Any change would be a change away from perfection and would be in some sense degrading or getting worse. And if we don't think that happens to God, then we should say God doesn't change, because time and change are fundamentally intertwined. According to Aristotle, for example, and lots of thinkers since, God can't be inside time. So that was one of the reasons for people thinking that God existed outside of time. But that raises some problems, because God is, most religious people believe, able to act within the world. That's why people pray. That's why people believe in the incarnation. They think that God came in human form and entered the spatiotemporal world of our experience. So this is a real puzzle, and this is a puzzle that's been puzzling people from the birth of Christianity up to now, and I'm sure other religions talk about it as well. How can somebody or something, some being that's outside of time, that's eternal, act in the world? Because those acts in the world are temporal events. So we have a problem. Is God really changeless, perfect, and outside of time? Or do we have to get rid of those ideas and think that God is within time and, in that sense, able to act in the world, able to enter into intimate relationships with people that evolve over time, but then maybe ceases to be perfect or ceases to be all powerful because he might be himself trapped in the flow of time? So these are really interesting and central questions, I think, to Christian theology. And for that reason, they've been thought about for almost 2,000 years.
Indeed, indeed. And one part, while I got so many questions now, so I took down some notes while you were talking because I didn't want to interrupt. Despite being an interviewer and a podcast, I have the terrible habit of interrupting people, so I'm trying to get better at this. Now, you mentioned William Lane Craig, very famous Christian apologist, and then you mentioned that he defends the A theory of time. We'll get to the. I mean, in fact, I was going to ask you if you could outline a bit the theories of time. We'll get to that for sure. But before, one thing I've always kind of been perplexed by is this simple, almost naive question, Emily, is that I see Christian apologists try to make naturalistic. Okay, let me put the caveat that it's generally analytic theologians, people who work in like systematic theology, kind of like people like Plantinga or Craig. So they try to make naturalistic arguments for God. So they try to take existing contemporary theories in physics, and they say, okay, therefore the A theory time is the proper metaphysical theory of time, or whatever the case may be. But I always wonder, but then at the same time, they also attack naturalism and materialism. They also say, no, the naturalistic worldview is wrong. And it's like, if God is a supernatural being, why in the world do you even care about the B theory, A theory, or D theory of time, for God's sake? I mean, just you could just posit that God is a supernatural being, and there's no reason to have any kind of make any arguments to trying to explain God in naturalistic terms. So I'm curious, as someone who's again engaged with this literature, what are your views on this idea of trying to defend, let's say, a certain theory of time based on, yeah, you could call it natural philosophy, but at the same time, on the other hand, saying that, but God is a supernatural being, he's outside of time, he doesn't really fall into the natural laws.
So one of the important distinctions I think we need to make when talking about naturalism, which you brought up in your question, is between methodological naturalism and metaphysical naturalism. So methodological naturalism is a presupposition of science, and it's basically the idea that we need to assume that the world is entirely naturalistic. That means it's entirely ruled by physical laws, material processes, and there's nothing supernatural in it. Without methodological naturalism, you can't do science because you'd always be potentially saying, well, there could be some supernatural influence here that we can't measure, etc. So methodological naturalism is essential for the practice of science, and theologians who are interested in science totally acknowledge that fact and say we need to protect methodological naturalism in science. What they critique is metaphysical naturalism. Metaphysical naturalism goes above and beyond that to say there is nothing else other than what can be measured by science. Now, I think I'm probably more sympathetic to metaphysical naturalism than any Christians, but so that's an important distinction that we want to make. They're not saying by saying that we need to engage with natural laws and with science, they're not committing themselves to that extra assumption that the world doesn't contain anything other than those natural laws. You need that to do science. Now, to your broader question about why would a Christian want to engage with science, it's actually a really, really old idea. And it has roots in the Bible. It also has roots in medieval and early modern philosophical theology. And this is the idea, basically, that if God is the creator of the world, then you come to know God by understanding the world better. So in scriptures, there's one of the, I think it's Psalm 19, I can't remember, it says the skies proclaim the work, or the skies declare the glory of God, they proclaim the work of his hands, something like that. That's not exactly it, but it's the idea that by looking at the heavens, you can come to learn more about the creator. And there was also a metaphor called the two books metaphor, which is the idea that there are two books written by God. By reading both of them, you come to know God better. And that's the book of scripture, i.e., the Bible, and the book of nature, i.e., the natural world. And so you actually come to know the creator better by doing science. So that's one of the reasons that Christian theologians are motivated to engage in science and religion, because they say, well, there should be deep resonances between what the Bible tells us and what science tells us. And now there's a whole different debate we can have about whether that's true or not. And I'm actually writing another book at the moment called Decoding the Cosmos, where I look at physics and Christian theology much more broadly than I've done before and say, is there really a compatibility here? And I think in some areas there are, and in some areas there aren't. And we need to be really open about that. And we need to have a really open and frank conversation about that. But it does, to an extent, depend on how you interpret the Bible. So if you think that everything in the Bible is literally true, then you're going to think that the earth was created 6,000 years ago. There's no evolution. There were two literal people called Adam and Eve, and they really ate some forbidden fruit, and then sin and death entered into the world. If you read the opening verses of the Bible as a myth or a symbolic representation of an alienation between humanity and the creator, then you're going to be perfectly fine with the idea that the earth is very, very old. So I mean, yeah, that's a long and rambling answer to your question. You could write several books answering that question. So hopefully that's begun to explain some of the motivations why religious people might want to engage in science and how successful the bringing together of science and religion can be.
Yeah, excellent. No, I mean, I think I mostly agree. I mean, also one thing you mentioned on your book, Decoding the Cosmos, as you said, that what you're working on, it's not even about finding compatibility, because I'm coming to realize that it's again a bit of again, speaking for myself here, a bit of a prejudice, let's say, that I have had, is this idea where I'm trying to synthesize things, I'm trying to find compatibility. And I'm coming to realize, no, I mean, the world difference as such exists in the world, and that's okay. Like, not everything has to be compatible and make sense in like a very systematic, holistic kind of theory. Just seeing if these different fields could speak to each other itself, there's value there. But no, thank you for humoring me with that, Emily. In fact, that question I asked.
Could I just push back on that quickly before we move on?
Oh yeah, please do. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I agree with you. I think that maybe not every system or area of human thought can be synthesized. But that's because I come at it from an atheistic perspective. If you are religious, you do have a problem if science and scripture don't fit perfectly together, precisely for the reason that I outlined, which is that Christians and people of other religious faiths as well believe that God created the world and God divinely revealed the scriptures. So we should expect to see agreement. And if we don't, if there's a really profound disagreement between what science tells us and what the Bible tells us, then there's a theological problem there. I mean, does that disprove the existence of God? I think no, I don't think we can go quite that far. But that's the kind of thing that Richard Dawkins was arguing, that if science doesn't fit with scripture, then we've got some problems, we've got some questions to ask. So if you're an atheist, it doesn't matter. But if you're a religious person, maybe it does.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of point. In fact, this is probably an apocryphal story, but the person who discovered the Big Bang, he was a physicist, but he was also a priest. And there's this anecdote, again, probably apocryphal, that in his church, or wherever, when he did discover the Big Bang, a lot of his congregants, or people in his church community, told him, don't use this as evidence for truth of Christianity, because this is bad, because what if the Big Bang is it goes wrong? Then so the idea was that you shouldn't use scientific evidence to justify the truths of Christianity, because scientific evidence, as we all know, is constantly changing. It's as in, the theories themselves are constantly evolving. So you can never you can never say, due to this theory, Christianity is true. And I thought that was a bit of like, it was a bit funny, like how, yeah, like when you have this very holistic, all-encompassing worldview, it's really hard to maintain it whenever we discover there's new knowledge, be it in science or some other field, for that matter.
Yeah, so it was that Georges Lemaitre you're thinking
Yeah,
of,
yeah, that's right. I
the
forgot his
Catholic
name.
priest
Yeah,
in the
Catholic
1930s.
priest. Yeah.
Yeah, so it was actually him who was wary of using the Big Bang to prove the existence of God. And it was a conversation he had with the Pope. So you're absolutely right about the gist of the conversation. But he used Einstein's theories of general relativity, or equations from general relativity, sorry, to show, along with Edwin Hubble's observations of galactic redshift, which showed the universe was expanding, that if we reverse time, we go back to a point of almost infinite heat and infinite density, and potentially beginning of the universe, out of which everything exploded, and that's what we now know as the Big Bang. The Pope at the time said, oh, this is fantastic. This is evidence for fiat lux, which is Latin for let there be light, which is the claim in the Bible which sparked the creation of the universe. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. And Lemaitre actually said, we should be really, really careful of doing this for exactly the reasons that you describe. If we tie theology, or if theists tie theology too tightly to the science of the day, they risk that theology becoming outdated, stale, or even wrong as the science inevitably updates. So yeah, you're absolutely right. That was it's an interesting quirk of history, that one.
Indeed,
That the
indeed. Yeah.
person who discovered the Big Bang was a priest and yet warned
And
the
yet
Pope
wary
against
of
using his work for
yeah,
religious ends.
yeah. No, thank you for correcting my kind of historical inaccuracy there, because I thought it was in fact his, I don't know, his church community or whatever, but it was he himself who said, "Don't use this as evidence for
That's
God."
right.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting. Yeah, because this whole thing about, the idea of like what's the, let's call it, the epistemic status of religion. It's a criticism Kierkegaard, existentialist Kierkegaard made about philosophy as such. He said that philosophy shouldn't engage in any kind of trying to make, for example, like ontological arguments for God. He thought all of that was nonsense, and because he was like, his whole thing was, no, God is something that thought can't think of. He had a very extreme version of it. Now I disagree with him, but I thought it is an interesting book. So, okay, back to your book, Emily. Okay, the best part is that you give a lovely introduction to the kind of the metaphysical theories of time. So if you could, and I know this is a big ask because you wrote a whole book on it, just at a high level, if you could outline what are in the philosophy of time, what are the theories of time, but also the kind of the specifically more in analytic philosophy, the A, B, C, and then
Mm-hmm.
as to why you yourself you side more with the block universe or the B theory of time.
So I'll give a really, really quick summary. And for any listeners who are interested in learning more, I recommend you go and buy the book. It's
Links,
often discounted on Amazon, so
yeah, links down
keep an
below.
eye out. And
Yeah. Excellent.
great.
And leave a
So
review. And leave a review, please.
yeah, leave a review. That would be much appreciated. So the three theories of time that dominate contemporary analytic philosophy are called the A theory of time, the B theory of time, and the C theory of time. We can trace this back to the publication of a seminal article called On the Unreality of Time by Jeremy McTaggart, published in 1908. And he introduced this terminology, and it's taken off, and all philosophers of time use this terminology now. So McTaggart said that there were three different ways that we could describe a temporal series. And that is in terms of whether the events in that series possess the objective properties of past, present, and future, whether they are just ordered in terms of temporal relations earlier than and later than, or whether they are ordered just in terms of temporal betweenness relations. So this is between this and this is between this, but there's no inherent order. And roughly that sums up the A theory, B theory, and C theory. But I'll go into a little bit more detail because I think that'll probably not be very clear for listeners. Basically, the A theory of time is the idea that time flows. Time is dynamic, it's objectively tensed. I would imagine most people's common sense understanding of time is this. So there is an objective past. Things that are in the past are gone, they don't exist anymore. There's an objective present moment, and that moment is shared throughout the entire universe. And everything that exists is what exists now. And then there's a future, and the future isn't yet real. So we have this objective moment, present moment, which is causing events to come into existence and fall out of existence as they go from future to present to past. And there is some objective flow to time. That's the A theory. The B theory says that time is like space. So we have three spatial dimensions, and all all locations in space are equally real. You know, this location that I'm sitting in is as real as the location that you're in, is as real as Proxima Centauri out in the galaxy. The B theory says that moments in time are like this. The past is just as real as the future, is just as real as the present. So somewhere out there in the cosmos are the dinosaurs, and is a potential human colonization of Mars if that ever happens. And there's no objective difference between these other than from our perspective. So there's a subjective difference in moments in time. We experience time as though it flows, but it actually doesn't. So just like when I look around me, it seems to me, if I don't think about it too deeply, that only what exists in this room. But actually, of course, I know when I open the door, I can walk outside. There's my house. I walk out into the street. I'm in Oxford, and I can travel anywhere within space, within reason, you know. And the idea is that time is like this as well. So we move through time like we move through space, but all moments of time exist. And the C theory agrees with this, but says there's no inherent direction to time either. So the B theory says there is an objective beginning and an objective end. The Big Bang and the Big Crunch, if that's how the universe ends, are the beginning and end. Whereas the C theory says there is no real direction of time either. Time doesn't flow or pass, and there's no objective beginning or end. All that matters is which events are between which other events. Now, the C theory doesn't have very many proponents other than Matt Farr at the University of Cambridge, who's doing really interesting work on the C theory of time. But most people are either B theorists or A theorists. So if you're an A theorist, you might endorse presentism, which is the idea that only the present moment exists and time objectively flows. If you're a B theorist or a block universe supporter, then you think that time is just the fourth dimension of space-time. And this is where Einstein's relativity theories come in. So Einstein's special theory of relativity showed us that time and space are actually unified in the more fundamental space-time. And time is just the fourth dimension of this. And Einstein also showed us that there isn't any physical grounds, as far as we know, for saying that there is an objective moment all the way across the universe. What's present for me is different to what's present for somebody on a different star somewhere else, or orbiting a different star somewhere else in the galaxy. And if that's true, if there is no absolute simultaneity, then there seems to be no way we can ground an objective present moment that's the case across the whole universe. So the arguments get quite technical, but I hope in the book I give them a clear explanation of how it all works in a lot more detail than I'm able to here. But basically, I think that the B theory or block universe has the most support from physics at the moment. And so that's why I support the B theory. And I would say it's the majority position in physics and potentially philosophy as well. But in theology, you're more likely to get A theorists for religious reasons.
Yeah, I think in fact the theory, it's a C theory that I kind of intuitively I find a bit hard to understand, especially because, correct me if I'm wrong, Emily, they posit that there's no direction to time, and there's no like
Correct.
present, future, back, and I just intuitively I didn't know how to make sense of that. Whereas even the B theory, when you do put it that way, I can see what you're saying, especially given what we have with the Eddington experiment with Einstein and all of that. So, and like when you mean, again, just to put it very naively, when you mean objective time, it's like if there's some kind of like universal clock where when there's change in the universe, that is an objective change, not something that's local to a certain area, or if it's like a oh well, yeah, I guess local to a certain area. Excellent. So, and the reason you subscribe to the B theory, it's just more kind of because most physicists and philosophers tend to agree with that, or do you have your own? Is it like pure democracy, or do you have your own?
No, no.
You
No,
know,
argument from
story?
consensus is not a good way to do
I
philosophy.
was just gonna
So
say,
no.
yeah, that was
Yeah.
partially joking, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah. So no, there are very good reasons from both physics and metaphysics for thinking that the block universe is the right way of understanding space and time. So it's the argument from special relativity that I said that the relativity of simultaneity seems to indicate that there is no objective present moment. And if there's no objective present moment, then you don't have this sharp divide between the future and the past. My future and your future will be slightly different. And in marginal cases, or from some observational perspectives, there'll be events that will be in your present and my future if we're moving at different speeds different velocities relative to the speed of light. So, I mean, I think it's probably not helpful to go into too many technicalities here, but those are the arguments from physics, and the arguments from metaphysics are multifarious as well. So McTaggart argued, who wrote this original paper introducing the terminology, that the A theory is self-contradictory and so cannot be correct. So that's a metaphysical argument as well.
Excellent. And then, so then in the end of the book, you posit that this creates deep problems for salvation. They use that other technical term, which I can't pronounce, soteriology or something.
Soteriology.
Soteriology. There you go. Yeah. So it creates problems for salvation. So if you could just expand, I think you kind of did in the beginning touch on this problem. If time didn't really, if the B theory, what it would cause, but so what are the problems this B theory of time or the block universe creates for Christianity or a believer?
So the big problem, I think, is the problem of change. So in the block universe, all events exist. That includes all events in your life and all iterations of you. So the me when I was 5 years old and the me when I'm 80 years old, if I'm lucky enough to live that long, are all equally real in the block universe. And sometimes personal identity is described in terms of a 4-dimensional space-time worm. So I don't know, one way to think about it is you're like a worm or like a salami, and each perspective or each you this me that I feel is just a slice of that. It's pretty hard to envisage, but that's probably the best way to think about it. So the problem of change, or the problem of personal change, is that if all moments in your life are equally real, then it's hard to see how you have objectively changed from one state to another. So another way to put it is, we think of change as being an objective change or an objective change in properties from one moment to another. So let's say on Monday, I have blonde hair, and then I dye my hair brown, and on Tuesday, I have brown hair. One way to think about this is when the date changes from Monday to Tuesday, I change from having blonde hair to brown hair, because Tuesday we might think of is objectively now, then I objectively have brown hair and I don't have blonde hair anymore. I've changed. But if Monday and Tuesday are equally real, then in what sense have I changed from having blonde hair to having brown hair? I simply have blonde hair at this time and brown hair at this time. This problematizes the doctrine of salvation, because salvation, at least personal salvation that happens within your life, requires change. You need to change from being fallen to being saved. And according to Christians, the sin or the fallenness is supposed to be overcome and got rid of by God. But that doesn't seem to be possible. So that's the problem of personal salvation. There's also a problem of eschatology. So Christians believe that the physical body will be resurrected, and that will be the same body, because this resurrection is based on the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus, they believe, rose from the dead and had scars from his crucifixion on his body. It's the same body that was crucified that was raised. But if we try and think about what happens to the physical body when the universe has come to an end, then we fall into lots of other problems there as well. So the way that I frame it in the book is, if you want to be a B theorist, you face the problem of personal salvation, because the B theory struggles to accommodate change. If you want to be an A theorist, you face the problem of the end of the universe and no body left to be resurrected, because according to the A theory, as soon as something becomes past, it disappears. So when your body has been buried and decayed and has vanished out of existence, there's no physical body left to be resurrected. So basically, in a nutshell, the argument is, whether you're an A theorist or a B theorist, if you're a Christian, you've got some problems to face.
Yeah, yeah. And so just on a bit of a tangential point here, in what are your views on just like questions like, free will and human freedom? Because in some sense, specifically in a block theory, in a block universe, in the B theory, the concept of free will wouldn't make sense. I mean, the fact that we humans are free to choose in some objective sense doesn't make any sense, right? Or do you think free
Well,
will
it depends.
within a block universe? Yeah, sorry, go ahead. I interrupted. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's fine. It depends. So in the book that's being published soon by Cambridge University Press, I take on the problem of freedom more extensively. I didn't really have the space to cover it in God's Salvation and the Problem of Spacetime. But in very brief, there are some philosophers who think that the truth of determinism means that free will is impossible or is an illusion. So determinism is the idea that there's only one possible future given the initial conditions of the universe and the laws of nature. And philosopher Peter van Inwagen put it this way. He called it the consequence argument. If I am to be free, then I need to be in control of the consequences of my actions. But if determinism is true, then the consequences of my actions were fixed before I was even born. In fact, they were fixed at the Big Bang because the initial conditions and the laws of the universe cause only one future to evolve. And if that's the case, then I'm not really free. Another way to put it is to think of myself as, when I think of myself as making a free choice, I think I have a range of options and I deliberate and then I choose one of the options, but all of the other options were viable or were available to me. So one example or one way of sketching this out is thinking about what I had for breakfast this morning. So I felt like I had a choice between toast and between fruit and yogurt. But actually, if determinism is true, then the fact that I chose toast was predetermined from the Big Bang. I never had any choice, and it was only an illusion that I could have ever chosen to have fruit instead of toast. So the block universe, where the block universe comes in, is that its block universe has a fixed future. So it's difficult to see how humans can be free because we can't alter the future. We can't change the outcome of the events that form the body or the story of our lives. That position is known as incompatibilism. There is an alternative which is called compatibilism, and that's advocated by people like David Hume, who say, okay, well, maybe the future is fixed, but it doesn't matter because what the future is fixed by is to some extent the actions that humans take. So Hume said it doesn't matter if there was only one outcome. The fact that you still chose that outcome means that you were free. I mean, we could spend hours talking about the free will and determinism debate, but that's it in a nutshell, is that in the block universe, the future is fixed. Some people think that raises a problem for free will. Other people are a bit more comfortable with talking about free will in that context. Laying my own cards on the table, I'm quite skeptical of free will. I think free will probably doesn't exist. But in the book, in my next book, I do explore one potential way of talking about free will in the block universe, which is called freedom from the inside out. But we probably don't have time to go into huge detail about that. It's something that I explore in the book as a potential solution, but I don't think that I want to endorse it as being true.
Yep. So this is your book, the upcoming one, Salvation in the Block Universe, right? And
That's
so
right.
is
That's
this
right.
where you bring in Emily Paul Tillich's work? Excellent. So yeah, if you could please comment a little bit. I mean, I want to be cognizant of your time. We've still got about 20 minutes because I do kind of want to ask you about a few of your papers on your the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics too. But let's see if we have time for that. So I'm curious because you are an analytic philosopher and you work through, more through kind of systematic theology and whatnot. But Paul Tillich, I find him a very interesting character because he comes more from so-called continental philosophy. He works with people like Kierkegaard, and he's worked with like Heidegger and all these thinkers. But what got you interested in Paul Tillich's work, and now that to go as far as incorporating his work into your research and into your writing?
So one of the things I love about Paul Tillich is that he's an outward-facing, creative, dynamic thinker, and he has this method for doing theology or philosophical theology that he calls the method of correlation. And I think the method of correlation can be hugely helpful for people working in science and religion, and actually in any type of religion and culture, for example, which is something he wrote a lot about as well. The method of correlation says theology shouldn't be stagnant and stale. Instead, it should update itself and it should move with the times. So the method of correlation says you need to begin by looking at the culture or the society that you're in and say, what are the existential questions? What are the philosophical questions that are really driving people here? What matters to people? What are the frameworks that we're working in? What are the things that are really troubling people? What problems is this society facing? And that's the existential or philosophical question. And then he says you should give a theological answer, which is basically trying to look to religion, to Christian theology specifically for him, and identify ways that that religion can help answer those questions. So that's the method. But the broader idea is that theology is never finished. No theological system is ever fixed. Instead, we should view the practice of theology as being on a train, with each system being like a station. This is an analogy he uses himself. And each time we move on, we're getting closer to deeper understanding, but the journey's never over. So his theological system was one stop, one station, but he encourages people to take up his work and say, re-examine it, rethink it for your own culture, your own day. So not that many people are writing on Paul Tillich at the moment, which I think is a real shame. He was hugely popular in the 20th century, and then he kind of fell out of fashion. And I think the reason for this is I think he was almost a victim of his own success. He wrote wonderful reflections on his own culture. He was really deeply affected by what happened in Germany in the middle of the 20th century. He vociferously opposed the Nazi Party and he was chased out of Germany. And he wrote reflections on human nature that stemmed from his experience of Holocaust. And that means that his theology is quite tightly tied to the concerns and the needs of his own culture. And as society has moved on, he seems less relevant. But the whole point of the method of correlation is that we should be using his ideas or theological ideas in dialogue with culture. So I think we need to reinvigorate Paul Tillich and start looking at the questions that drive us today. And that's one of the reasons I was really interested in bringing Paul Tillich into the conversation when I was writing my PhD thesis and later my books.
Yep. No, I love that, especially given that you deal with a lot of analytic philosophy, and the fact that you could bring in some of Paul Tillich's work is excellent. I mean, I completely agree. He's just a very engaging, riveting, engrossing writer, but also, in fact, he himself was an individual, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, Emily, that faced a lot of personal suffering. I mean, he had a lot of PTSD from what happened in Germany. You know, he was one of the first people who opposed the Nazi regime. He was a dissident, and then I think he had like a couple of times where he had like mental breakdowns, and he was 2 or 3 times in his life. So he's a person who truly knew what it was like to face despair and
Yeah.
and saw the evils of what human beings could do. In fact, maybe if it's okay, when the book is out, I'd love to have you on again once I've read it to discuss Paul Tillich specifically, because I would love to explore more of his work, while also perhaps
That'll be great.
yeah, juxtaposing that with some of the more contemporary, philosophy of physics questions. Excellent. So just since we are, in the interest of time, I'm curious, Emily, just on the interpretations of quantum mechanics. I couldn't read, all your papers or all the stuff you wrote. You recently had one on the many worlds and moral responsibility. Do you currently have you changed any of your views on let's say time, or some of your more metaphysical views in lieu of, or what's in light of what we've found through quantum mechanics, and also people like Tim Maudlin or whoever that's interpreting these theories? Have you got any updates to your worldviews in that regard? But also, if you could discuss specifically pertaining to quantum mechanics, what are the implications, again, back to your, field, which is theology and Christianity in particular?
So I'm going to take your first question first. And that is, there's still so many unanswered questions when it comes to the nature of time and quantum mechanics. So physics faces a really profound problem, and that is that its two most successful theories are currently incompatible. So we've got general relativity, the theory of gravity and of space-time, which describes the cosmos. It describes things on a very large scale. And then we've got quantum mechanics, a theory of subatomic and atomic particles. It describes the smallest levels of reality. And in various ways, they're incompatible. General relativity models reality as smooth and continuous. Quantum mechanics describes it as discrete and particulate. I mean, there's lots of other differences that we don't need to go into. But basically, the point is gravity and quantum mechanics are currently incompatible. We don't have a theory of quantum gravity which would unite them. And until we do, we don't really have any firm answers about the nature of time, because we need a quantum theory of time as well, and we don't have that. So in a sense, what I've learned from quantum mechanics, well, I knew this already, that we can make good estimations about the nature of time. We can have good evidence for believing in certain theories. So I feel confident in my belief in the B theory, but I also know that some further finding from science could come and overturn it completely. So the real lesson is that you have to be willing to change your mind. And if and when we do develop a quantum theory of gravity, I mean, firstly, that will be a hugely, hugely exciting day in the history of physics. But we might need to radically reconceptualize everything we knew about time, which I think is hugely exciting. You just have to, as somebody working in science and religion, you just have to be willing to accept that everything you say could be proven wrong tomorrow. And yeah, it's a terrifying and exciting thought.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. In fact, Philip Goff, who the British idealist, you probably are familiar with him, I'm sure. He said something which was quite interesting. It was like, isn't it really interesting that with quantum mechanics in particular, it shows that Stephen Hawking was in some sense completely wrong, because because of all these paradoxes, these incompatibilities, it seems like all the deep philosophical questions are coming back. All the questions that we thought were answered are coming back because of what we are seeing, this incompatibility between the two fundamental theories of modern physics. But yeah, just I interrupted you there. The second part was, given that, how does that affect, again, Christianity and belief in God and salvation and all these topics to explore?
So I don't think, because of the unanswered questions, I don't think there's anything else that I can add on quantum mechanics, time, and salvation at the moment. I think that's basically.
Yeah, so pardon me. What I meant was more was, the question wasn't clear. I'm sorry. It's like, for example, you wrote this paper on the Everett interpretation. So, as in, there are certain interpretations, and in your view, with these current interpretations we have, how does that problematize, once again, belief in God and Christianity?
Yeah, I think we might need to film a completely separate episode on that, because so the way that my research has panned out so far is I've had the research on time and salvation, which is the book that you have very kindly read and interviewed me on today. And then my second project is the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I would love to talk about that with you more. I don't think we have the time to do it now.
Yeah,
So
I've
maybe
got to read
we
it
can
first. Yeah, I've got to read it first. Yeah,
maybe we can have I can
I'd
come
love
back on
to.
the
Yeah,
podcast and we
I'd
could
love to.
talk about it, because there's so much to say about the many worlds interpretation and Christian belief and philosophy, theism, but we won't do it justice now. So maybe that's a teaser
totally
for
fair.
next time.
Yeah, it's easy for next time. Yeah, totally fair. And hopefully, along with that, also Paul Tillich. But maybe that'll be another episode. I mean, I'm
Yeah.
planning to do this podcast until I can't do it anymore. So therefore, let's hope
Brilliant.
we can keep going. Excellent, Emily. We've got about 10 more minutes. Is that okay? If we can go for you've got it.
I think I probably need to finish
Yeah,
now, if
that's
that's okay.
totally fine. Yep. In that case, thank you very much for your time. Just one last question. Any other projects that you apart from, so you got a book coming on, and what any other? So I guess in your intellectual journey, what's the next big question you're currently exploring, if I could put it that way?
Yeah, so the next thing, well, the thing I'm in the middle of is looking at the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. And I'm in the middle of that project. So the first phase of the project has been identifying looking at what are the problems here? What problems does the many worlds interpretation raise for Christianity? And in the next phase of the project, which I'm about to embark on, I'm going to be looking at, are there any solutions to these problems? So I see this as being a 5-6 year project where I really delve into the many worlds interpretation in a way that nobody engaging with religion has done before. So that's what's next. And it's mind-bendingly weird as well as super, super interesting. So yeah, I really love to come back on and talk about that with you another time. I think there's lots of stuff to talk about there.
Excellent, excellent. I'd be honored. Beautiful. I mean, for the next episode, thank you very much for your time, Emily. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've really, really enjoyed talking to you. So thank you so much for having me on.